Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
I knew something was wrong the second I stepped into my mother's house. The air inside, carrying the faintest scent of roses and vanilla, the same floral perfume Olivia had worn since we were teenagers. There was a quiet hum of movement from upstairs, a rustling sound, the unmistakable shuffle of fabric being adjusted. And for a moment, I wondered if I had walked in on something I wasn't supposed to see. But nothing could have prepared me for the sight waiting for me at the top of the staircase. Olivia, standing in front of my mother's full-length mirror, glowing under the soft afternoon light, wearing my wedding dress. The breath caught in my throat, my fingers tightening around the strap of my purse, my entire body freezing as if someone had pulled the ground out from beneath me. The dress was unmistakable, the delicate lace detailing along the sleeves, the intricate beading along the bodice, the flowing train that had once made me feel like I was walking in a dream. And now, it was stretched across Olivia's body, the white silk hugging her curves, the same fabric that had once belonged to me now molded to her as if it had been hers all along. For a moment, I thought maybe this was a joke, some kind of cruel misunderstanding, some ridiculous prank my sister had orchestrated just to see my reaction. But then I saw the way my mother was beaming at her, hands clasped together, eyes misty with admiration, like this had been the plan all along. And that's when it hit me like a punch to the gut, like a betrayal so sharp it cut straight through my ribs. They had done this behind my back. I swallowed hard, forcing the lump in my throat down, my voice coming out tighter and colder than I intended. What the hell is going on? Olivia turned to the sound of my voice, her face lighting up with something that wasn't quite guilt, wasn't quite apology, more like the smug satisfaction of someone who had already won. "Oh, Emily," she said, smoothing her hands down the front of the dress, tilting her head like she was expecting me to admire her, to tell her how perfect she looked, to pretend this wasn't the worst thing she had ever done to me. "I was hoping you wouldn't find out like this." I let out a sharp, humorless laugh, my fingers curling into fists, my nails pressing into my palms so hard that I could feel the sting of skin breaking. "You mean you were hoping I wouldn't find out at all?" My mother sighed, stepping forward, placing a gentle hand on Olivia's shoulder, the kind of protective touch that had always been reserved for her and never for me. "Sweetheart, don't be dramatic," she said, her voice soft, the way it always was when she was trying to make me feel like I was the unreasonable one, like I was the one causing a scene. "It's just a dress." Something inside me snapped. I took a step forward, my voice shaking with barely contained anger, my vision tunneling as the reality of what they had done settled deep into my bones. "It's not just a dress," I said, my voice low but sharp, cutting through the tension in the room. "That was my wedding dress, the one I spent months picking out, the one that was supposed to be for me. And you," I turned to Olivia, my breath coming faster now, my pulse pounding in my ears. "You had no right to touch it, let alone wear it." Olivia had the audacity to roll her eyes, shifting her weight onto one foot, her lips curling into a small, infuriating smirk. "Oh, come on, Em," she said, her tone light, dismissive, as if this was nothing more than an inconvenience to her. "It's not like you ever got to wear it. It was just sitting there collecting dust in Mom's attic. What was I supposed to do? Go out and buy a new one when there was a perfectly good dress just waiting to be used?" I sucked in a slow, sharp breath, my entire body trembling with the effort of not completely losing it. "You were supposed to ask me," I snapped, my voice rising, my anger breaking free now, clawing its way to the surface. "You were supposed to have enough basic human decency to at least check with me before you stole something that wasn't yours." My mother let out a small, exhausted sigh, rubbing her temples like I was nothing more than a difficult child throwing a tantrum. "Emily, sweetheart," she said, her tone taking on that sickeningly patient quality that always made my skin crawl. "It's not like you were ever going to use it. It's been years since." "Don't," I cut her off, my voice shaking, my hands clenching at my sides so tightly that my nails bit into my skin. "Do not stand there and act like my wedding never happened just because it didn't end the way you wanted it to." A heavy silence settled over the room, thick with everything left unsaid, with years of resentment, with the undeniable truth that had always stood between us. My wedding had been called off, yes. My engagement had ended, yes. But that didn't mean my dress. Asterisk, asterisk, the one thing I had left from that chapter of my life. Asterisk, asterisk was free for Olivia to take like it was nothing. I exhaled slowly, forcing my voice into something calmer, something sharper, something that held a promise beneath the anger. "You had no right," I repeated, my voice steady now, cold and controlled in a way that made Olivia shift uncomfortably. But don't worry. I'll make sure this day is just as unforgettable for you as it is for me. Olivia frowned, tilting her head slightly, the first flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. What's that supposed to mean? I smiled then, slow and deliberate, the kind of smile that wasn't warm, wasn't kind, but meant trouble. You'll find out soon enough. And with that, I turned on my heel and walked out, leaving behind the stunned silence, leaving behind the weight of their betrayal, leaving behind the dress that no longer mattered, because I had something much better planned. Olivia thought this was her perfect day. She had no idea what was coming. I drove aimlessly for over an hour after storming out of my mother's house, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, my mind running through every possible response I should have thrown back at them. The betrayal sat heavy in my chest, a familiar weight, a feeling I had learned to live with a long time ago, but had never quite figured out how to carry. This wasn't just about the dress. It was about everything. Every single time I had been pushed aside, every moment I had been forced to accept that I was never going to come first in my mother's eyes. Every sacrifice I had made just to be told that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention were left after Olivia took what she wanted. Because that was how it had always been. Growing up, Olivia had been the kind of girl people naturally gravitated toward, effortlessly charming, endlessly adored, the golden child who could do no wrong. She had been the homecoming queen, the straight-A student, the one who never had to try as hard as I did but still somehow managed to shine brighter. I had always been the afterthought, the backup, the convenient second choice. If Olivia wanted something, she got it. If Olivia needed attention, she took it. And if I ever dared to want something for myself, I was selfish for not understanding that she simply deserved it more. I had spent my entire childhood standing in the shadow of someone who never even noticed I was there. And the one person who had ever told me that I mattered, the one person who had ever defended me, the only person who had ever looked at me and truly seen me, had walked away a long time ago. I pulled into an empty parking lot, cutting the engine, gripping the steering wheel as I let the memories crash over me like a wave I had spent years trying to hold back. My father had left when I was 16. I had stood in the doorway, watching him pack his things, my breath caught in my throat, my heart hammering against my ribs, feeling something break inside me even before he said the words I already knew were coming. My mother had stood in the background, arms crossed, expression tight, refusing to show even the smallest sign of emotion, as if the end of their marriage was just another inconvenience she had to deal with. Olivia had been cry, of course. She had always been good at making everything about her. And me? I had just stood there, waiting, hoping, silently begging him to tell me something that would make it hurt less. He had kneeled in front of me, his hands gripping my shoulders, his eyes filled with something that looked an awful lot like guilt. "It's not about you, Em," he had said, his voice low, careful, like he was trying to soften a blow that was already too deep to fix. "This has nothing to do with you." But that wasn't true, because when he left, he had taken the only real protection I had ever had. I had spent years waiting for him to come back, waiting for him to tell me that he regretted it, waiting for him to see that I was still here, still trying, still wanting to matter to someone. But he never did. And eventually I had learned to stop waiting. I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to push the memories away, to shove them back into the box I had kept them locked in for years. This wasn't about the past anymore. This was about Olivia, about my mother, about the way they had stolen something from me without a second thought. I wasn't going to let it go, but I wasn't going to waste my energy on screaming matches or petty fights either. No, this required something bigger. If Olivia wanted to walk down the aisle in my wedding dress, if she wanted to pretend like she had done nothing wrong, if she wanted to act like she could take whatever she wanted from me and never face a single consequence, then it was only fair that I made sure she had to live with the consequences of her own choices. And I knew exactly where to start. I spent the next few hours digging into Olivia's perfect little life, scrolling through old social media posts, clicking through endless engagement pictures, scanning through comments from mutual friends, searching for anything, any small crack in her perfect fairy tale that I could sink my claws into. At first, it was the same shiny, flawless version of Olivia I had come to expect. Smiling photos, romantic captions, perfectly curated snapshots of a life that looked as effortless as it was infuriating. But then, just as I was about to give up, just as I was about to slam my laptop shut in frustration, something caught my eye. A comment. Buried beneath hundreds of heart emojis and congratulations messages. A single line that didn't belong. Wow, can't believe he actually went through with it. I frowned, clicking on the profile of the woman who had written it, my heart pounding just a little faster, my fingers suddenly trembling with something I couldn't quite name. Her account was private, but her bio was simple, a name I didn't recognize and a single word beneath it. Fiancé. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting, a slow, sharp realization creeping up my spine like ice water. There was only one reason a woman would comment something like that on an engagement post. There was only one reason she would call herself a fiancé. And there was only one reason she would sound so bitter. Olivia's perfect fiancé wasn't who he claimed to be, and I was going to find out exactly what he was hiding. I sat back, exhaling slowly, the familiar rush of adrenaline humming beneath my skin, the feeling of something finally falling into place. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about truth. And if Olivia wanted to steal from me, if she wanted to take the one thing that had meant something to me, if she wanted to walk into her wedding day believing that she had won, then it was only fair that I made sure she had the wedding she truly deserved. She had no idea what was coming. I sat in my car for a long time, the weight of my discovery pressing down on me like a thick, suffocating fog, my fingers tapping rhythmically against the steering wheel as I tried to piece together what I had just found. Olivia's fiancé wasn't just some guy with a past. He was someone who had already stood at the edge of the altar before, someone who had made promises to another woman, someone who had walked away from an engagement like it was nothing. And yet, here he was, smiling in every photo, whispering words of forever into Olivia's ear, spinning the same fantasy all over again. The comment on Olivia's engagement announcement had been too deliberate, too bitter, too personal to be ignored. It wasn't the kind of offhand remark someone left as a joke, nor was it the kind of thing a stranger would say without reason. This woman, this so-called fiancé, knew something that Olivia didn't, something that had been buried beneath the glossy perfection of their relationship, something that Olivia, in all her blind confidence, had failed to see. And I was going to make sure she did. I started small. Olivia was too arrogant, too self-assured, too wrapped up in the illusion of her perfect life to believe anything outright. So I had to be careful, had to be strategic, had to let doubt slowly drip into her mind like a poison she wouldn't notice until it was too late. The first move was subtle, too subtle for her to recognize it for what it was. I sent her a simple text, something light, something easy to ignore if she wanted to. Hey, just curious. Did you and Adam ever talk about past relationships? You know, exes and all that. I imagined her frowning at her phone, rolling her eyes, dismissing it immediately as yet another attempt from me to make her wedding about myself. And sure enough, her response came fast, sharp, and dripping with condescension. Nice try. I know you're still bitter about the dress, but this is pathetic. I smirked, my grip tightening around my phone, because this wasn't about the dress anymore, and soon Olivia was going to realize that. I waited a day before making my next move. This time, I waited until I knew she'd be with Adam, waited until I knew they'd be out in public, somewhere she wouldn't want to make a scene, somewhere she would feel the eyes of everyone around her. Then I called her. She didn't pick up. She never picked up on the first call. So I called again, and again, and again, until finally I got a short, irritated text. What? I'm busy. I didn't waste time. I just ran into someone who knows Adam. She said something interesting. Call me when you're alone. That was it. Just enough to make her skin crawl. Just enough to make her feel the first hint of uncertainty. I didn't expect her to call me back right away. I knew her too well for that. Olivia wasn't the type to panic openly, wasn't the type to crumble in front of people, wasn't the type to let the world see her crack. She would smile. She would pretend nothing was wrong. She would keep her perfect little world intact for as long as she could. But inside, she would be unraveling. By the next morning, she had taken the bait. I woke up to a text from her, shorter than usual, lacking the usual smugness, laced with something she didn't want me to see. What exactly did you hear? I smiled, stretching lazily before picking up my phone, making sure to wait just long enough before replying, letting her stew in her own paranoia. Oh, nothing important. Just that Adam has an interesting history when it comes to engagements. I could practically feel her heartbeat spiking through the screen. What the hell does that mean? I stared at the message for a long time, debating whether I wanted to push her further today or let her spiral on her own for a little while longer. But before I could decide, before I could carefully craft my next response, my phone buzzed again. This time, from an unknown number. I frowned, unlocking my phone, my stomach twisting just slightly as I opened the message. I know what you're doing. Call me? There was no name, no explanation, but something about it sent a chill down my spine. Because whoever had sent it wasn't Olivia. And they weren't asking. They were telling me. I sat up slowly, my pulse ticking a little faster now, my mind racing through every possibility, every scenario, every way this could go. Had Olivia already confronted Adam? Had he figured out that someone was digging into his past? Had I stepped into something bigger than I realized? I hesitated for only a second before calling the number back, pressing the phone to my ear, my breath slow, steady, prepared for whatever came next. The line rang twice before a woman's voice answered. Emily Carter? I stiffened, gripping the phone a little tighter because she knew my name. Who is this? I asked, my voice even, careful, hiding the sudden unease creeping up my spine. There was a pause, then a slow exhale. I'm the woman Adam left before he proposed to Olivia. A heavy silence settled between us, thick with everything she wasn't saying yet. I swallowed hard, glancing toward the window, watching the way the early morning sun cast long shadows against my apartment walls, knowing that whatever she was about to tell me, whatever secret Olivia had been too blind to see, was about to change everything. You need to know the truth, the woman said, her voice lower now, edged with something dangerous, something urgent, something final. Because if Olivia marries him, she's going to regret it for the rest of her life. I leaned forward, gripping my phone so tightly it hurt, my breath catching in my throat, my heart pounding against my ribs. And then, slowly, I smiled. Olivia had stolen from me. She had taken something that wasn't hers. She had played dirty. Now, it was my turn. The silence on the phone stretched between us, thick and heavy, as if the woman on the other end was measuring her words, deciding just how much of the truth she wanted to give me. I sat completely still, fingers clenched so tightly around my phone that my knuckles ached, my breath slow and controlled, because I already knew whatever she was about to tell me wasn't just going to ruin Olivia's wedding. It was going to shatter her entire life. My name is Claire, the woman finally said, her voice lower now, more cautious, like she was afraid of being overheard. And Adam, well, Adam wasn't just my fiancé. We were together for 4 years. We had a wedding date set, invitations printed, dresses bought. Then, 1 month before the wedding, he disappeared. I blinked, my grip tightening on my phone, my stomach twisting with something sharp, something that felt a lot like fury. What do you mean, disappeared? I asked, my voice flat, my heart pounding faster now, my mind racing ahead of the conversation, trying to piece together what she hadn't said yet. I mean, Claire continued, her voice shaking just slightly, that one day, he went out for a business trip and never came home. No warning, no fight, nothing, just gone. A week later, I got an email. One line, no explanation. I can't do this. Don't look for me. He cut off all contact, left our apartment, deleted every trace of our life together. It was like I had never existed to him. I sucked in a slow, sharp breath, letting the weight of her words settle into my bones. He had done this before. Adam had walked a woman to the edge of forever, whispered promises, built a life with her, convinced her she was safe, and then vanished. And now Olivia was next. Why are you telling me this? I asked, forcing my voice to stay even as my pulse thundered against my ribs. Claire let out a slow exhale, her voice tighter now, more certain, laced with something that sounded a lot like guilt. Because when I saw his engagement announcement, when I saw your sister's name, I realized something. I knew her mother. For a moment, the words didn't make sense, didn't fit together in a way that felt real. And then, suddenly, my entire world tilted on its axis. You knew my mother? I asked slowly, my voice quiet, careful, already knowing that whatever she said next was going to change everything. I didn't just know her, Claire said, and I could hear the faintest edge of bitterness in her tone now, the kind of anger that had been sitting beneath the surface for a long time. She met me while I was still with Adam. She knew who I was. She knew about our wedding. And she never told Olivia. The breath left my lungs all at once, sharp and jagged, as if someone had just punched the air out of me. My mother had known. She had known all along, and she had chosen to stay silent. I drove to her house without thinking, my hands gripping the wheel, my mind reeling, my entire body vibrating with rage. The betrayal of my mother giving Olivia my wedding dress had felt like a knife in my back, but this was so much worse. She had known that Olivia's perfect fiancé was a liar, that he had already abandoned one woman at the altar, that he had a history of leaving without warning. And she had chosen to protect Olivia's fantasy instead of telling her the truth. I slammed the car door behind me, barely pausing before pushing the front door open, storming inside, my breath coming fast and sharp, my vision blurring at the edges with fury. My mother was in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a cup of tea, the picture of calm, controlled indifference. But when she saw my face, something in her expression flickered. "Emily," she said carefully, placing her cup down, her voice edged with the kind of forced patience that made my skin crawl. "I wasn't expecting you." I let out a short, sharp laugh, shaking my head, the anger inside me boiling over, my hands trembling at my sides. "Yeah, well, I wasn't expecting to find out that you knew Olivia's fiancé was a liar and still let her walk into this marriage blind." I snapped, my voice shaking, my chest tightening, because how could she do this? How could she look at Olivia and still let her believe she was safe? My mother didn't flinch. She didn't look shocked. She didn't even bother pretending to be surprised. Instead, she just let out a slow breath, shaking her head, her expression unreadable. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out," she said simply, like we were discussing something as minor as the weather. My entire body went still. "You were wondering when I'd figure it out?" I repeated slowly, my voice quieter now, deadlier, laced with a sharp edge of disbelief. She sighed, smoothing her hands over the table, like she was already exhausted with this conversation. "I didn't tell Olivia because I knew it wouldn't matter," she said simply, and the calmness in her voice made something inside me snap. She wouldn't have believed me, and frankly, I didn't see the point in ruining something she was happy about. It's her life. She can make her own decisions. I let out a humorless laugh, shaking my head, my vision blurring with a sharp, bitter kind of fury. "Her life?" I repeated, stepping closer, my hands clenching at my sides. "You let her believe a lie because you didn't want to ruin her wedding. Do you even hear yourself?" She finally looked at me then, her expression cool, unwavering, filled with the same indifference she had always shown me. "Emily, you need to let this go," she said, her voice soft but firm, the same tone she had used my entire life, the same tone that had always meant this conversation is over. "Olivia is getting married, and there is nothing you can do to change that. She's happy. Don't take that away from her, just because you're still bitter about the past." And there it was, just because you're still bitter. As if my anger, my pain, my entire existence had always just been some kind of inconvenience to her. As if none of this mattered because it was me saying it. I took a slow breath, my hands shaking, my heart pounding, my chest aching with the weight of everything I'd spent my whole life trying to ignore. And then, finally, I let myself do the one thing I had never done before. I let go. I straightened, my face smoothing into a mask of perfect, eerie calm, the same kind my mother had worn so many times before. "You're right," I said, my voice steady, so calm it made her blink. "There's nothing I can do to stop this wedding." She nodded, satisfied, turning back toward her tea, already dismissing me, already convinced she had won. But she had no idea, because I wasn't trying to stop the wedding anymore. I was going to let it happen. And when the moment was right, when Olivia was standing at the altar, when she believed her perfect day had finally come, I was going to blow it all apart. Claire sat across from me at a small cafe on the other side of town, her fingers wrapped around a coffee cup that had long gone cold, her gaze fixed on the table between us like she was still trying to decide whether she had made a mistake by agreeing to meet me. She was beautiful in a quiet way, with dark, intelligent eyes that had seen too much and a voice that carried the weight of someone who had learned the hard way that trust was a dangerous thing to give. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, the air between us heavy with unspoken things, with truths that had been buried for too long, with the kind of pain that didn't fade no matter how much time passed. Finally, Claire exhaled, lifting her eyes to meet mine, her expression unreadable but sharp, as if she was waiting for me to ask the wrong question. "You wanted to know about Adam," she said, her voice steady but laced with something bitter, something sharp around the edges. "So go ahead, ask." I took a slow breath, steadying myself, choosing my words carefully, because I knew whatever she told me next would change everything. "Why did he leave you?" I asked, keeping my voice even, controlled, ignoring the way my heart pounded against my ribs, because deep down I already knew the answer. Claire let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking her head like she had asked herself the same question 1,000 times and still hadn't found an answer that made sense. "Because Adam doesn't love anyone but himself," she said simply, and the certainty in her voice sent a slow, cold chill down my spine. "Because he gets bored. Because the second things stop being perfect, the second real life creeps in, the second he feels like he has to work at something, he runs." I exhaled slowly, the pieces finally clicking together, my hands tightening around my coffee cup as I let the truth settle into my bones. "And you think he's going to do the same thing to Olivia?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer, even though I had already seen the signs, even though I had already felt the sharp sting of knowing my sister was walking straight into a trap she didn't even realize had been set for her. Claire tilted her head slightly, studying me, her lips pressing into a thin line, and for the first time since we sat down, I saw it. The flicker of hesitation, the brief moment where she almost seemed to pity me. "I don't think," she said finally, her voice quiet, final. "I know." I drove straight to my mother's house, my pulse racing, my thoughts tangled in 1,000 directions at once, my hands tight around the steering wheel as the weight of what I knew pressed down on me. Olivia didn't just deserve to know the truth. She needed to know. Because no matter how much I resented her, no matter how much anger and jealousy and bitterness sat between us, no matter how many times she had taken things from me, I wasn't going to let her make the biggest mistake of her life just because our mother had decided to protect a lie. I didn't even bother knocking when I got there, shoving the door open, my breath sharp, my heart hammering, my mind already racing ahead of me. Olivia was in the living room, flipping through a bridal magazine, the perfect picture of a woman who had no idea that her entire world was about to collapse. She looked up at me, her expression immediately shifting into annoyance, her lips parting like she was about to launch into yet another speech about how I needed to let things go. But I didn't give her the chance. "We need to talk," I said, my voice cold, my body tense, every inch of me humming with barely contained fury. Olivia rolled her eyes, tossing the magazine onto the coffee table with an exaggerated sigh, clearly already exhausted by the conversation we hadn't even had yet. "God, Emily, what now?" she groaned, standing up, crossing her arms over her chest like she was preparing for another round of, "I'm the victim, and you're just bitter." I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm, forcing myself to keep my voice level, forcing myself to give her one last chance to hear me before it was too late. "It's about Adam," I said, watching as something flickered in her eyes, something small but unmistakable fear. "I met someone today. Someone who knows him better than you do." Olivia scoffed, shaking her head, already dismissing me, already building her wall higher, already refusing to listen. "Oh my God, are you serious?" she said, her voice laced with pure exasperation. "Is this another one of your pathetic attempts to ruin my wedding? Because newsflash, Emily, you don't matter." The words hit their mark, sharp and deep and cruel. But I refused to let them show, refused to let her see how badly she could still hurt me after all these years. Instead, I just stared at her, my expression unreadable, my hands clenched in a fist at my sides. "You're making a mistake," I said, my voice quieter now, lower, laced with something she had never heard from me before: certainty. "And when Adam leaves you, when you're standing in the ruins of everything you thought was real, when you realize that you walked straight into a trap and ignored every warning sign, I want you to remember this moment." She didn't say anything, but the flicker of doubt in her eyes was enough. It wasn't over yet. I was halfway to the door when my mother's voice stopped me cold. "Emily." I turned slowly, my breath sharp, my body still thrumming with adrenaline, with anger, with something dark and unshakable. She was standing by the staircase, arms crossed, her expression unreadable, but there was something else there now, something I had never seen before: fear. "You need to stop this," she said, her voice quieter than before, her hands gripping the railing like she needed to hold on to something. "You don't understand what you're getting yourself into." Something inside me stilled. For years, my mother had dismissed me, ignored me, acted like I didn't exist unless Olivia needed something to compare herself to. And yet, now there was something in her voice, something different, something real, something that made my pulse spike with sharp, immediate suspicion. "What does that mean?" I asked slowly, stepping closer, watching as her grip on the railing tightened, as her breath hitched just slightly. A pause, a hesitation, and then, finally, "There are things you don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper now, the kind of voice people use when they are hiding something far bigger than anyone realizes. "Things about your father, things about why he left, things about this family that I have spent years trying to protect you from." I felt my breath catch, my hands tightening in a fist at my sides, my entire body going cold. Because I had come here to expose Olivia's wedding. But now, for the first time, I was realizing there was something much bigger at play. And I was finally going to find out what it was. The church was beautiful in that pristine, soulless way that only expensive things could be, the kind of place where people whispered about love like it was something delicate, something pure, something that could never be broken. White roses lined the aisles, their scent thick in the air, candles flickered along the walls, their soft glow casting long shadows. And somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of a string quartet played a song that sounded like a funeral dressed up as a love story. I stood in the back, tucked behind a row of elaborately dressed guests, my fingers curled around the small envelope in my hands, my breath steady, my pulse slow and deliberate, my mind racing with a single, unshakable thought. Was I really going to do this? For days, I had wrestled with it, had turned it over in my mind, had debated whether I wanted to destroy Olivia's wedding or let her walk blindly into the biggest mistake of her life. I had gathered the proof, had met the woman Adam had abandoned, had watched my mother twist the truth with the same ease she had used to manipulate me my entire life. I had been given every reason to stand up in front of these people and burn Olivia's perfect day to the ground. But was it worth it? Would she even listen? Would she even care? I sucked in a slow breath, scanning the crowd, recognizing too many faces, watching as people whispered behind gloved hands, watching as the same people who had always praised Olivia, who had always dismissed me, gathered here to celebrate her, completely unaware that they were about to witness a disaster they'd be gossiping about for years. And then the music shifted. The doors at the back of the church opened, and there she was, my sister, walking down the aisle in my wedding dress. I felt something sharp twist inside me, something dark and bitter curling in my chest, something old and familiar and undeniably cruel. Olivia had always been the kind of girl who took what she wanted without asking, who smiled sweetly as she reached for things that weren't hers, who convinced the world that she deserved more simply because she had never once had to fight for anything. And yet, here she was looking like she had won, like she had never considered the possibility that this day wouldn't go exactly as she had planned. I exhaled slowly, my hands tightening around the envelope, my breath evening out, my decision finally settling into place. I was going to ruin her. The ceremony felt like it lasted a lifetime, a slow, painful march toward a moment I had already decided wasn't going to happen. I barely listened as the priest spoke, barely heard the rehearsed vows, barely noticed the way Olivia beamed up at Adam like he was the best thing that had ever happened to her. All I could focus on was the moment, the exact second I would step forward, the exact way I would shatter this illusion she had built for herself. And then the words came, "If anyone here has any reason why these two should not be wed, speak now or forever hold your peace." A weighted silence fell over the church, the kind that stretched just long enough to make people shift in their seats, just long enough to make Olivia's fingers twitch against Adam's, just long enough for the illusion of perfection to settle for one final second. And then I stepped forward. The movement was small, but in a room full of people trained to ignore me, it was enough. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the crowd, confusion flickered across Olivia's face, her lips parting as if she was about to demand an explanation, as if she was about to scold me for daring to interrupt her moment. But before she could speak, before she could cut me down, I held up the envelope. And just like that, the world shifted. "Olivia," I said, my voice steady, cool, calculated in a way that made her stiffen, made her eyes widen just slightly, made my mother inhale sharply from her seat in the front row. "Before you say your vows, I think you should read this." She stared at me, her grip on Adam's hands tightening, her entire body suddenly rigid with unease. "What the hell are you doing?" she hissed, her voice low, her carefully practiced mask slipping just a little. I took another slow step forward, my expression giving away nothing, my heartbeat perfectly steady. "I met someone a few days ago," I said, keeping my voice calm, watching as her nails dug into Adam's wrist. "A woman named Claire. She wanted me to give this to you." The color drained from Adam's face. For the first time, he looked afraid. Olivia frowned, her eyes flicking between the envelope and Adam, confusion slowly morphing into something sharper, something darker, something dangerously close to realization. "Adam," she asked, her voice quieter now, but the tension in her shoulders said everything. Adam's jaw tightened, his hands twitching at his sides, his entire body coiling with the kind of fear only a liar feels when he knows the truth is seconds away from catching up to him. "Open it," I said, my voice soft, but laced with something that left no room for argument. For a long, excruciating second, Olivia didn't move. And then, slowly, she took the envelope from my hand. She tore it open, her eyes scanning the words, her lips moving slightly as she read, her expression changing with every single sentence. And then, suddenly, her fingers crushed the paper in her fists, her entire body trembling with fury. "You knew," she whispered, her voice shaking, her breath coming fast and uneven, her wild eyes snapping toward Adam, who had gone completely pale. "You knew I'd find out. That's why you wanted to elope. That's why you didn't want a big wedding." Adam opened his mouth, but nothing came out. And that was when she understood. That was when the truth finally hit her. That was when her perfect life shattered into pieces. The guests were silent, horrified, leaning forward in their seats, their eyes darting between Olivia and Adam like they were watching something they shouldn't be seeing. The priest took an uneasy step back, his hands hovering near his Bible like he thought maybe God himself would step in and fix whatever this was. And then Olivia turned to me. Her breath was uneven, her cheeks flushed, her hands still clutching the crumpled letter like it might disappear if she let go. "You," she hissed, her voice shaking, her body quivering with rage. I smiled, slow and deliberate, tilting my head just slightly, watching as she finally realized what I had done. "You stole from me," I said softly, just loud enough for only her to hear. "I just returned the favor." And then, with the entire church watching, with my mother frozen in horror, with Adam standing in the ruins of the life he had tried to build, with Olivia shaking with the weight of a betrayal she never saw coming, I turned and walked away. The drive home was silent. The only sound coming from the steady hum of my tires against the road, the distant echoes of what had just happened still replaying in my mind, sharp and vivid and undeniable. The moment Olivia's face had fallen, the way Adam had frozen in place, the audible gasp from the crowd as realization rippled through them like a slow-building storm. It had all happened so fast, but at the same time, it had unfolded exactly the way I had imagined, down to the very last second. I should have felt satisfied. I should have felt victorious. But as I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white, I realized I felt something else entirely. Something heavier. Something I didn't know how to name. I had spent my entire life being pushed aside, watching Olivia get everything she wanted, watching my mother bend over backward to make sure she never faced a single consequence. I had been told to stay quiet, to be the reasonable one, to accept that Olivia's happiness mattered more than mine, that it was my job to let things go. And for years, I had done exactly that, until I didn't. Until I gave her a reason to finally notice me. But as I pulled into my driveway, my hands still shaking, my mind still racing, I realized I wasn't just waiting for Olivia's reaction. I was waiting for the fallout. It came sooner than I expected. I had barely stepped inside, had barely shut the door behind me, had barely even caught my breath before my phone rang, the sharp, jarring sound cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. I didn't even have to look at the screen to know who it was. My mother. I let it ring twice before answering, pressing the phone to my ear, already bracing myself for the storm. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Her voice exploded through the speaker, raw with rage, sharp with something that sounded almost like disbelief, like she genuinely couldn't understand how I could have done something like this. "You just humiliated your sister in front of everyone. Do you have any idea how much damage you've caused?" I exhaled slowly, closing my eyes for a brief second, forcing myself to stay calm, forcing myself not to let her anger sink under my skin the way it always did. "She deserved to know the truth," I said simply, my voice steady despite the way my heart was still pounding. I wasn't going to stand there and let her marry a man who was going to leave her the second things got difficult. My mother let out a short, bitter laugh, the sound cold and sharp and filled with the same dismissive tone she had always used with me. "You think this was about protecting her?" she snapped, her breath coming fast, uneven, the sound of something clattering in the background telling me she was probably pacing in the kitchen, gripping her wine glass like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "You didn't do this for Olivia. You did this because you wanted revenge." The words stung more than I expected them to, more than I wanted to admit, because the truth was, maybe she wasn't entirely wrong. Maybe there had been a part of me, a deep, hidden, ugly part, that had wanted Olivia to feel what I had felt, to understand what it was like to have something you loved ripped away from you, to finally know what it felt like to be blindsided. Maybe a small, selfish part of me had wanted her to hurt. But not like this. I had expected anger. I had expected screaming. I had expected a fight. But I hadn't expected the silence. I hadn't expected Olivia to just disappear. I found out through a friend, someone who had been at the wedding, someone who had watched the disaster unfold, someone who had stayed behind to witness what happened after I walked away. Olivia had locked herself in the bridal suite, refusing to talk to anyone, refusing to leave, refusing to even look at Adam after he had tried to explain himself, after he had stammered out weak apologies, after he had reached for her, and she had shoved him away like he was something rotten. And then, just as the guests had started whispering, just as the weight of what had happened had truly started to settle, she had walked out. Not in my wedding dress, not in the gown she had stolen from me, but in the clothes she had arrived in, her hair still pinned up, her makeup smudged from tears. And she had left. No grand speech. No dramatic confrontation. Just silence. And that was how I knew. This had broken her in a way I hadn't expected. She had spent her entire life being adored, being praised, being worshipped by the people around her, living in a world where she was untouchable, where things always worked out in her favor, where she never had to worry about the kind of betrayal she had so effortlessly handed out to others. But now, for the first time, she was alone, and I had been the one to do it. I sat on the edge of my bed that night, staring at my phone, scrolling through missed calls and unread messages, my stomach twisted into knots, my hands still unsteady, my mind still reeling. My mother had called again twice. Some relatives had reached out, some to yell, some to pry, some to act like they suddenly cared about my existence now that I had done something worth talking about. And then, just as I was about to put my phone down, it rang again. But this time, the number wasn't one I recognized. I frowned, staring at the screen for a long moment, my pulse spiking slightly, a strange, uneasy feeling creeping up my spine, because I knew, whoever this was, it wasn't going to be good. I hesitated for only a second before answering, pressing the phone to my ear, my breath slow, careful, measured. Hello. A pause. And then, Emily. My entire body went still. The voice was deeper than I remembered, rougher around the edges, but I knew it, had memorized it, had spent years replaying it in my head even when I didn't want to. It was him, my father. I swallowed hard, my grip tightening on the phone, my breath catching in my throat, my heart pounding loud enough to drown out everything else. Dad, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, barely able to believe I was saying it out loud. Another pause, another slow breath, and then, we need to talk. The line went dead before I could respond, before I could even begin to process what had just happened, before I could ask him why, after all these years, after everything, after leaving me behind, after never looking back. Why now? I sat in my car outside the small diner, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, my breath slow and steady, my mind still trying to catch up with the reality of what was happening. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few late-night stragglers, the neon sign above the entrance flickering slightly, casting an eerie glow against the wet pavement. This was the place he had chosen, the place where he had told me to meet him, the place where, after more than a decade of silence, my father had finally decided I was worth speaking to. I had played this moment over in my head countless times throughout the years, had imagined a dozen different versions of this reunion, each one fueled by anger, by sadness, by a desperate need to understand why he had left, why he had chosen to disappear when I needed him most, why he had never once tried to come back. But now that I was here, now that I was seconds away from walking through that door, now that I was about to come face to face with a man who had abandoned me, I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just exhaustion. Because after everything that had happened, after everything I had done, after everything I had uncovered, I wasn't sure there was anything left to feel. I exhaled slowly, pushing open the door, stepping into the warmth of the diner, the scent of coffee and stale grease hanging heavy in the air, the low hum of a radio playing softly in the background. And there he was, seated in the farthest booth, his hands wrapped around a half-empty cup of coffee, his eyes locked onto me the second I walked in. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of too many years and too many unanswered questions stretching between us, thick and suffocating. He looked older than I remembered, more tired, more worn, his once dark hair streaked with gray, his face lined with the kind of regret that didn't just come from age, but from something deeper. And yet, he still looked exactly the same, still familiar, still the man who had walked out of my life and never looked back. I walked toward him slowly, sliding into the seat across from him, folding my hands on the table, keeping my expression neutral, my voice flat, controlled, careful. You wanted to talk, I said, not bothering with small talk, not bothering with anything that resembled warmth, because this wasn't a reunion. This wasn't some long-awaited homecoming. This was unfinished business. He exhaled, running a hand over his face, nodding slightly, his eyes never leaving mine, like he was still trying to figure out who I had become. Yeah, he said finally, his voice lower than I remembered, rougher, filled with something I didn't quite recognize. Yeah, I did. I waited, silent, letting him speak first, letting him carry the weight of whatever it was he had been holding on to for all these years. And then he said something I never expected. "I know what your mother did." The words sent a slow, sharp chill down my spine, my fingers tightening slightly against the table, my heart skipping a beat, because I hadn't expected that. I had expected excuses. I had expected apologies laced with weak explanations. I had expected him to say he was sorry, but I hadn't expected the truth. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice careful, measured, but something inside me was already unraveling, already knowing, already bracing for what was coming. He exhaled again, shaking his head slightly, staring down at his coffee like it held answers he wasn't ready to face. "I left because of her," he said, his voice quieter now, more raw. "I left because I found out what she had done to you. To me. To all of us." I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry, my pulse picking up speed, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I wanted to know. "What did she do?" I asked, forcing the words out, my breath shallow, my fingers gripping the edge of the table, because my mother had already lied about so much. "What else had she been hiding?" He looked up then, his eyes meeting mine, his gaze steady, filled with something that looked an awful lot like guilt. "She made sure you never mattered," he said simply. And it hit me harder than I expected, sharper than I was prepared for, because deep down, I had always known that. But I had never heard it out loud. "I wanted to take you with me," he continued, his voice heavier now, his hands tightening around the cup. "When I left, I wanted you to come. But she made sure you didn't. She told me you didn't want to go. She told me you hated me. She told me you didn't need me." The air left my lungs all at once, my stomach twisting, my hands trembling slightly, because that wasn't true. That had never been true. She had lied. She had taken him from me. And I had spent my whole life believing he had never wanted me. A slow, sharp kind of rage settled in my chest, cold and unforgiving. Something deeper than anger. Something that had been buried inside me for years. Something that would never fully go away. I let out a slow breath, nodding slightly, because I understood now. My mother had spent her whole life protecting Olivia. And she had spent just as much time making sure I disappeared. When I left the diner, the sky had darkened, the streetlights flickering to life, the air cool against my skin, my mind heavy with the weight of everything I had learned, everything I had lost, everything I would never get back. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just walked, because in the end, it didn't matter. I had gotten my revenge. I had ruined Olivia's wedding. I had exposed the truth. But standing there, alone, under the flickering glow of the streetlights, I realized something I hadn't expected. No one had really won. Not Olivia. Not my father. Not even me. I pulled my phone from my pocket, staring down at the screen, my thumb hovering over the keyboard, my breath steady, my hands still shaking slightly. And then finally I typed out a single message. One last move. One last choice. One last loose end to tie up. I hit send. And then, without looking back, I walked away.